Autumn of 1889 came in dry and harsh, not with color, but with wind that scraped the fields bare. Out near the Colorado border, 2 miles outside of a township called Willow Flats, the land had hardened with the summer drought. There were cracks deep enough in the earth to swallow a child's boot. Sagebrush clawed up from the dust like the hands of the desperate, and the sky held no promise of rain. On the edge of this brittle land, a small clapboard house leaned against the wind. Its shingles flapped with every gust, and the barn beside it was no more than ribs of wood and collapsed roofline. This was what Margaret Boyd had left, what she clung to. She stood in the yard with her arms tight around her middle, watching the last light of the day pull long shadows across the dirt. Her dress hung loose on her frame. Her boots were cracked at the toes. There was a hole in the heel of her left glove, and she did not remember when it had worn through. The baby Nathan whimpered in the cradle by the stove. He was teething. Rose, her eldest, barely 9, was trying to sew up a tear in the hem of her brother's shirt, with a rusted needle and fingers that trembled from cold. The boy Joel, all of 6, had not spoken since the letter came. It had been 7 weeks now. 7 weeks since the telegram from Fort Bridger saying her husband's body had been found crushed under a tipped wagon north of the Uinta Mountains. No explanation, no detail, just the end of things. The morning after the telegram, she had stood by the fence, staring west into the wind, and whispered aloud, "Why were you headed north, Ailey?" But the prairie had no answer. Since then, she'd learned how to stretch 1 pound of flour into 4 days of bread. She'd weaned the baby early, feeding him goat's milk warmed over coals until the goat died last Thursday. The cow had been sold long before. Now there was only dried beans, onions, a tin of lard, and 2 matches left in the tin box by the hearth. She had not cried, not when she read the telegram. Not when she nailed Eli's coat to the side of the barn as a scarecrow to keep the magpies off the last of the squash. Not when the preacher sent word that the church could not assist any further, but the Lord provides and the Lord sees. She hadn't cried even when Joel asked if his papa had gone off into the sky like the hawk they buried in August. But now, standing in the yard with her arms tight and her lips dry from windburn, she felt something give way inside her. Not loudly, but like the hinge of a cellar door giving out after too many winters. Something was slipping loose. She could not sleep. Not with the cold coming and no wood split. Not with Rose coughing blood into her pillow the night before. Not with the baby too small and thin to fight off sickness if it came. And it always came like wolves in January. The wind kicked up again, tossing grit into her face, and she shut her eyes hard. She was too tired for fear, too hollow for prayer. What did it matter anyway? No one was coming. No one ever did. Inside, the lantern flickered once and went out. The wind had found its way through another crack. She heard Rose say softly, "Mama," but her voice was too weak to rise. Margaret turned back toward the house, her body moving with the slow stiffness of someone aged beyond her years. She passed by the corner of the barn, meaning to check the shed for any last scraps of dry wood. That's when she saw the tracks. Fresh ones. A horse's hooves deep in the hard dirt, still moist around the edges. Someone had come down the ridge and turned east toward the flats, and they had not come more than a half hour ago. Her breath caught, not in hope. Hope was too sharp a thing for a woman like her. But in warning, because strangers did not come down that ridge unless they were looking for something. Or someone. She looked to the west, where the sun had dropped behind the bluff, leaving only a strip of fire in the sky. Then she looked back at the house. It was too late to bar the door. She squared her shoulders, straightened her coat, and went inside. Margaret moved through the dim house with the quiet precision of someone used to waking babies and dodging grief. She lit one of the 2 matches, just enough to spark the stove and warm the last of the goat's milk. The flame caught and hissed low. Rose had fallen asleep, sitting up, her back curled like a wilting fern, Joel's small hand clutched in hers. Margaret touched her daughter's forehead, damp, not burning, and pulled a quilt up higher. The boy didn't stir. She fed Nathan in silence, rocking him against her breast, while the wind knuckled the corners of the house. The cradle creaked. The boards moaned like they remembered better days. Margaret didn't speak or hum. Her lullabies had dried up weeks ago. Her eyes drifted to Eli's coat nailed to the barn. Even in the dark she could see it, the shoulders stiff with dust sleeves flapping in the wind like he might still be inside it. Eli had never been cruel. That was what made it worse. He'd been quiet, even solemn, a man who believed work was prayer and prayer was private. His hands were square, always rough with calluses, and he smelled like leather and smoke and sweat. Margaret had fallen for him because he listened. Not many men did. When she told him about her mama dying of the fever in Wyoming, or how she grew up sleeping 3 to a bed in a dugout, or how she hated the taste of salt pork, he just nodded and gave her the best cut off the bone without asking why. They weren't in love at first. Not really. Love was something that showed up later in the way he'd draw her bathwater after childbirth, or the way he built the crib high off the floor so rats couldn't reach. It was slow, steady, and quiet, until the spring of last year when something in him shifted. He started staying out late, taking on freight work further west, talking less. He said the farm needed money, said they'd lose the land otherwise. But when Margaret tried to look at the books, he got distant, gentle but evasive. "You don't need to worry about that," he said, once brushing a hand over her cheek like a goodbye. Then he was gone for 3 weeks. Came back thin and worn, wouldn't say where he'd been. That was the first time she saw the bruise on his ribs. The first time she noticed the way he checked the road before coming in from the barn. She never asked directly. She knew better. If a man wasn't ready to talk, words could do more harm than silence. But she knew something was chasing him. Or maybe he'd been running toward something. She could never tell which. Then came that final trip. He left with a promise of 3 days. It became 2 weeks. Then 4. Then the telegram. Margaret shifted Nathan higher on her shoulder and pressed her cheek to his head. He smelled like sour milk and wood smoke. His body was too light, but he was still warm. Still here. The sound of hooves broke through the wind. Close now. She froze. A single rider. Her mind ran ahead. Was it a debt collector, a drifter, someone Eli had crossed? She'd heard stories of men who came asking questions with a pistol in their coat, who called in favors her husband never paid. She set the baby down gently in the cradle, her palms damp. Her heart thudded in her throat. Then a knock. Not loud. Not hurried. 3 short taps. Margaret crossed the floor, picked up the rifle from behind the door. It wasn't loaded. She hadn't had cartridges since July, but the weight of it in her hand gave her backbone. She opened the door just wide enough to see. A man sat astride a dark bay, both horse and rider wet with sweat. His coat was dust-caked, collar turned up against the cold. His face was lined, maybe 40, with a day or two of beard and eyes like river stones, gray, unreadable. He tipped his hat. "Evenin', ma'am. I don't mean to bother you. I saw smoke from your chimney and hoped you might have directions. I'm off trail." His voice was low, careful. Margaret didn't speak. The man waited, then cleared his throat. "Name's Callum Briggs. I was headed to the Calverton Range, but my map's gone to hell and the storm drove me off course. Thought I might stable my horse here for the night. I've got coffee and salt meat to trade." At that her grip on the rifle loosened a hair. Salt meat. She opened the door 1 more inch. "You a rancher?" "Of sorts." "Armed?" He glanced down at his saddlebag. "I've got a pistol. I'll leave it with the saddle if it eases your mind." She stepped back. "You can use the shed. The barn's near fallen in." Callum nodded once. "Much obliged." He dismounted without flourish. Move slow like someone used to being watched. He unslung his saddle, unbuckled the bridle, and tied the reins with a short hitch. Then, true to his word, he pulled a colt from his belt and set it on the step. "I won't come in unless asked," he said. Margaret studied him. He wasn't lean like a drifter. He stood like a man who'd held ground through wind and fire. His eyes met hers just long enough to say he meant it. She shut the door. Inside, the fire had dimmed again. She dropped the rifle and leaned her head against the wall. A stranger had come. Not an enemy. Not yet. But not a savior either. She didn't believe in those anymore. Subscribe and stay where the stories live. By morning, the frost had thickened to a crust over the brush, and the wind had gone still, one of those rare silences on the plains that felt heavier than sound. Margaret stepped out with the bucket and hand boots, crunching over hard ground, her breath showing in short, uneven clouds. The sky was wide and cloudless, a brittle blue that held no warmth. The stranger was already outside, kneeling beside his horse. He was brushing the animal down with a folded scrap of cloth and humming low under his breath, some tune she didn't recognize. The horse looked better for the care flanks, dark with sweat, dried into salt, but eyes alert and steady. He looked up when he heard her. "Morning," he said, not too loud. "Hope I didn't cause offense setting up early. Didn't want to wake the house." She didn't answer right off. Just filled the bucket from the rain barrel, what little was left unfrozen. She could feel him watching her, respectful but not timid. "You said Calverton Range?" she asked, still facing the barrel. "I did. Too far north for cattle this time of year. That's sheep country." "I know." She turned. He stood straight again, arms crossed over his chest, the wind tugging his coat at the hem. There was something in his face she couldn't place, too clean-cut to be drifting, too worn to be green. "What kind of work do you do, Mr. Briggs?" "Fence mending, stock hauling. Broke horses for a while. Most men don't take this road in October." He gave a small smile. "Most men don't get lost." Margaret set the bucket down by the step. "I don't have room inside." "I figured. I have children." He nodded. "I heard them in the night. I stayed back." That stopped her. Not the words, but the way he said them, without self-praise, just stating a fact. She opened the door to go back in, then hesitated. "There's still some coffee on the stove. If you want to trade." "I would." He came to the door, but didn't step inside. Waited while she brought out a chipped enamel mug and filled it from the pot. He took it with both hands. "Thank you." She watched him drink. He didn't complain about the bitterness, didn't ask for sugar. From the cradle, Nathan gave a short, sharp cry. Margaret stepped back inside, cradled him to her chest, and rocked him while the older two slept on. Callum didn't leave the porch. He stayed out there, quiet mug resting on the rail, eyes watching the empty horizon like a man looking for signs in the dust. Later that morning, she found him at the woodpile, what little there was. He had taken it on himself to split the remaining logs, knotty old pieces from the collapsed barn wall. He worked without noise, the rhythm steady. She should have told him to stop, but she didn't. "You plan on staying more than a day?" she asked, arms folded against the wind. He rested the axe head in the dirt. "I plan on moving along soon as I know where I'm headed, but I don't mind working while I do." "You want something in return?" He looked at her then, long and serious. "Ma'am, I'm not looking to take from you. That much I swear." She didn't answer. Trust didn't come quick, not out here. Not after what the world had already taken. That evening he traded her half a slab of salt pork and 2 rounds of bread he'd brought wrapped in cloth. Said a Mormon widow in Monticello had baked them for the trail. Said he meant to repay her, but never made it back. Rose ate the bread in 2 bites. Joel just held his in both hands like it might disappear if he blinked. Nathan stopped crying that night. slept curled against Margaret's ribs, warm and still. Outside, the wind had risen again, but the house felt steadier somehow. She didn't know why, but she slept through the dark for the first time in weeks. And when she woke, she thought she heard someone whistling soft and tuneless, like a man who had known loneliness but wasn't trying to fight it anymore. The next 3 days passed with a kind of quiet rhythm Margaret hadn't known in years. Callum took to chores like he'd been born to them, hauling what little water was left from the well, digging out root vegetables she'd forgotten were buried beneath the frost, fixing the barn door, enough to keep the wind off what was left of the hay. He didn't speak much unless spoken to, and when he did, his voice carried the unhurried weight of someone who thought before answering. Margaret kept her distance. She watched him from the window while feeding Nathan, or when she knelt by the stove mending Joel's shirt. The children had questions, of course. Rose, curious and quick, asked if the man was a lawman. Joel asked if he could shoot. Margaret gave no answers. On the 4th morning, she found him by the fence repairing the wire. One of the posts had leaned sideways in the wind and taken a good stretch of the line with it. Callum worked with slow determination, sleeves rolled up, forearms streaked with dirt and old scars. "You don't owe me your labor," she said from behind him. He stood rubbing his hands on his trousers. "I know. Just seemed a waste, letting it fall apart. You plan on building a whole new farm before you leave." He looked out over the land. "No, just helping it hold together." That stopped her for a moment. She swallowed the sharp reply that rose in her throat and instead asked, "You been alone long?" Callum glanced sideways. "A while?" He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. She understood the shape of silence. Sometimes it said more than a story could. That evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Margaret stepped outside to shake the dust from a rug and found Callum near the fire he'd built behind the shed. He sat cross-legged, sharpening a small knife by lamplight. He looked up, surprised to see her. "I didn't mean to wake anyone." "You didn't." She stepped closer, wrapping her shawl tight. The fire threw up little sparks that drifted toward the stars. His face looked softer in the glow, less like a stranger. "You from the plains?" she asked. He shook his head. "High desert, mostly. Grew up east of Taos. Family still there." "No." The word sat heavy. After a while he spoke again. "I had a brother. Died in a mine shaft cave-in. I left not long after. Took work where I could. Cattle runs, mule trains, hunting down stray stock." He paused. "Got tired of leaving things behind. So I just kept moving." She sat on a low stump across from him. The night air was cold, but she didn't feel it as much. "You ever think of stopping?" she asked. He gave a dry laugh. "Didn't think I could. Till this week." That caught her off guard. She looked away toward the house. Inside, the fire would be dying down. Nathan would be fussing soon. Rose might start coughing. "You think that house of mine could make a man want to stay?" "No," he said. "I think you could." She met his eyes then, not in surprise, but in something deeper, a flicker of recognition, like two people seeing the same storm pass over different years of their life. He didn't move closer, didn't touch her. He just watched her like he could stand to look at her a long time and not flinch from the seeing. She stood then, brushing her skirt clean. "I've got to tend to the baby." He nodded. "Of course." She turned to go, but before she stepped inside, she said without turning around, "You can stay through the frost, so long as you keep working." His voice followed her in the dark. "Yes, ma'am." That night she slept lightly. Not from fear, but because something in her chest felt awake again. Not joy, not yet, but its shadow. And when morning came and she stepped outside to find her fence whole, her wood stacked, and her children laughing at something Callum had said, she let herself stand in the doorway a while, holding the baby close, watching, not smiling, But almost. The weather turned in early November. Frost gave way to snow, soft at first, then driving hard, pinning the family inside for 3 days. Callum stayed through it, sleeping in the shed wrapped in horse blankets and a quilt Margaret had handed him without a word. By then he had become a part of the household in small, quiet ways. He taught Joel how to tie knots properly and showed Rose how to boil water in a kettle without burning the bottom. He never hovered, never acted the father, just offered a hand where one was needed, and Margaret, she found herself softening in ways that frightened her. When he cut his hand on a broken hinge, she cleaned the wound with warm water and stitched the gash herself, her fingers steady, her face close to his. She didn't speak while doing it. Neither did he. But when it was over and he looked up at her with that gray, unreadable gaze, she had to turn away fast or say something she couldn't take back. She caught herself watching him more. Not just to keep the children safe. That part was already decided. Callum had earned their trust the way a good horse earns its bit, with patience, not force. Even Joel had started to talk again, mostly to Callum. No, she watched him for another reason. Because for the first time since Ellie left, she felt a man's presence in her home and didn't flinch from it. But that peace was fragile. It cracked the morning her brother-in-law rode in. His name was Thomas Boyd, Eli's younger brother by 4 years. A man of straight lines and sharper words, dressed in wool and purpose. His arrival came with the sound of hooves tearing through half-frozen mud, and the children rushed to the window, thinking perhaps their father had come back. When Margaret opened the door, Thomas stood tall in the yard, hat in hand, snow dusting his shoulders. "Margaret," he said, eyes sweeping past her to where Callum stood by the barn, pitchfork in hand. She didn't invite him in. Didn't have to. He stepped inside without waiting. Thomas had always talked like a man who expected things to be explained to him. He settled at the table, hands folded, and got to it. "There's land in Utah I can bring you to," he said. "Eli bought a parcel before he passed. My father's offered to help manage it. You'd be under protection there. Safe. The children, too." Margaret stood at the stove, her hands stiff. "I'm not leaving. You've got no kin here. No church. No support. You think this man out there's going to give you something solid? I know his kind." She turned. "Do you?" "I know enough. Passing through no roots. You think he'll be here in spring? He'll be gone soon as the snow breaks." From outside, Callum was chopping wood. The thud of the axe came steady, sure, like it always had. Margaret crossed her arms. "He's been here. That's more than most." Thomas's voice softened. "I'm trying to help. I lost a brother, too. You think Eli would want this?" She flinched. He saw it. He leaned in. "Come with me, Margaret. I'll take care of the children like they were mine." It was the way he said it, like she wouldn't be counted in that offer. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. "I buried Eli without a grave. I fed his children on scraps and silence. And I did it without any man's name to stand behind. I'll not trade my quiet for someone else's authority." Thomas stood, jaw tight. "If you let that man stay, don't expect help from the Boyds come spring." She looked him in the eye. "I didn't expect it this winter." He left before noon. Callum didn't ask what was said, but she found him later in the barn, sitting with his head low, elbows on his knees. "I'll go," he said before she could speak. "If it puts you in danger, I never meant to cause trouble." She stood in the open doorway, snow blowing in behind her. "You didn't cause it. You just made it harder for someone else to control me." He met her eyes. "You sure you want me here?" It would have been easier to say nothing, to let him leave and tell herself it was for the best. But the thought of that empty yard, the silence after the axe stopped falling, the way Joel would stop smiling again, she couldn't bear it. "I'm sure," she said, "if you're willing to stay." Callum stood slowly, stepped forward. Then I'll stay. She didn't reach for him. He didn't reach for her. But something passed between them just the same, stronger than a promise. The kind of knowing that didn't need words. Outside, the wind howled over the plains. Inside, the fire burned steady. The letter came by hand, delivered by a rider from the county office late in the afternoon as the sky turned heavy with snow again. Margaret read it once at the table, then again aloud while Rose stirred a pot of beans and Callum stood by the door, jaw tightening with every word. The debt Eli left behind had found its way home. According to the county, the land was never paid in full. A lion had been placed 6 months before his death, likely unbeknownst to her. The lion holder, a man named Royce Mather, now demanded payment in full, $240 or eviction by year's end. Callum spoke first. Mather? I know that name. Margaret folded the letter. Her voice was calm, but her hands were not. Who is he? Used to run herds down in San Juan. Heard he's moved into land speculation. Real bastard. The kind who sends men to collect before the ink dries. Margaret nodded once. Then we'll lose it. Not without a fight. She looked at him, her eyes sharper than he'd seen before. You think I haven't fought? No, he said. I think you've been fighting too long on your own. That night, after the children slept, they sat by the hearth. She unfolded the letter again, laid it flat on the table like a womb. Callum traced the corner with his finger. I know a man in town, he said. A lawyer. He helped my brother once years back. He might still be there. What would you ask of him? Time. We could push the court date. Maybe dig into how Mather came by the line. Maybe find a flaw. She looked at him. How much time would we need? He smiled faintly. A whole winter if we're lucky. And we're not. He leaned back, eyes steady. Then we'll find another way. The next morning, Callum hitched the horse and rode to town, a full day's journey each way through snow and wind. Margaret spent those days steeling herself. She gathered every scrap of paper Eli had left, every receipt, every note. She found the land deed smudged and incomplete, folded into a hymn book he never once sang from. She barely slept. He returned on the third day, coat stiff with cold, face pinched by the wind. He brought with him not hope exactly, but information. There's a loophole, he said. Eli never signed the final note. The bank filed it anyway, but it's thin. Fraud, if we can prove it. Margaret gripped the edge of the table. So we go to court. Not quite. Mather's sending someone out. Wants to settle it quiet. He doesn't want a courtroom either. The next evening the man arrived. A broad-chested negotiator with a gold watch chain and eyes like dull coins. He tried charm, first leaning on the frame of her door, offering her a way out. We're prepared to take over the loan and let you stay as tenants. You keep the house. Your man here keeps working. Callum stood behind her, unmoving. Margaret didn't blink. This is my land. My children's. You want to take it, you go through the law. The man sighed, shifting tactics. The law might not favor you. Callum stepped forward then. We'll take that chance. Later, after the man left with his coat drawn high and his temper pulled tighter, Margaret leaned against the doorframe, knees weak. Callum came to her side. You didn't have to face him alone. I wasn't alone, she said. And she meant it. Weeks passed. Snow deepened. The case sat in motion, slow and grinding. But with each day something else took root in that house. Not just survival. Something warmer. One morning she woke to find Callum already inside, kneeling by the fire with Nathan asleep against his chest, rocking slow, whispering some old song under his breath. Joel lay beside them, curled like a pup, and Margaret stood there for a long while before he noticed her. When he did, he didn't move or speak, just offered the quiet smile of someone who'd stopped running. She walked to him, knelt down, and pressed her hand to his. Not a gesture of passion, but of permanence, of choice. The first she'd made for herself in a long time. The storm broke just after New Year's, leaving the fields swept clean and the air sharp as flint. Margaret stepped out into it with bare hands, eyes narrowed against the brightness. The sky was vast and unclouded for the first time in weeks. Beneath her boots, the snow crunched clean and every sound carried far. Inside the house, Nathan laughed for no reason, that bubbling kind of sound babies make when the world feels safe. Rose and Joel were arguing over how to cut bread straight. These days, Margaret let them argue. It was a good kind of noise. The letter came in the second week of January, carried not by a stranger but by the same lawyer Callum had found. His coat was heavy with road dust, his eyes kind. "You won," he said, offering the envelope. She took it with both hands. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't drop it. Inside, stamped and signed, was the dismissal. The lion thrown out. The land now hers, and full legally and without contest. Callum stood behind her on the porch, one hand on her shoulder. He didn't need to say anything. That night Margaret brought out the last of the beans, the last of the winter squash, and a small tin of preserves she'd hidden since the baby was born. They ate by firelight, all 5 of them, without rush, without worry. Later, after the children had gone to bed, she and Callum sat outside under the stars. The yard was silent but not empty. The wind had softened to a hush. He held her hand, thumb brushing the curve of her palm. "You ever think," he said, "that maybe some things don't have to be earned? Maybe they just happen when you stay still long enough?" She looked at him. "I don't believe in luck." "I don't either. But I believe in choice." He nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small tin button, dented, an old one of Eli's from the coat still nailed to the barn. She turned it over in her fingers, then slipped it into Callum's palm. "I've carried it too long." He closed his hand around it. "I'll keep it," he said, "but only if you're not giving it away out of grief." "I'm giving it away because I'm ready." He didn't speak, just leaned forward, rested his forehead against hers, and let the moment stretch out until the night held it like a secret. Come spring, they planted the first new row of potatoes. Callum built a fence that curved with the land instead of cutting against it. Margaret painted the door blue, Rose's idea. Joel found an old horseshoe near the fence and nailed it above the lintel for luck, though Margaret said nothing. They married in June. Just the preacher, the children, and a pair of neighbors who came with cornbread and fresh eggs. Callum wore a clean shirt. Margaret wore the same boots she'd worn through that long winter. The rings were plain, carved from silver he'd traded for in town. She kept them in a tin on the mantel until the day of the wedding. Let them gather dust. Let them mean something before she wore it. And in time she stopped flinching at joy. Let it come and stay like a season that didn't leave so quickly. They built a pen for goats. Talked of raising chickens again. Nathan learned to walk across that wide yard before the leaves changed. One night, just before snowfall returned, Callum carved a name into the porch beam beside the door. Not his own. "Boyd?" He looked at her afterward. "I hope that's all right." Margaret nodded. "It's all right." The house stood firm that year. The children laughed louder. And in the quiet of dusk, when the wind rolled low over the grass and the windows glowed warm from inside, a passerby might thought this place had always been whole. But Margaret knew the truth. It had been broken, and then it had been chosen. And that made all the difference. Subscribe and keep your eyes on the horizon.